Let's go ahead and fetch our buildings from the import buildings node we've constructed a while ago. Let's drop down an object merge. And we want to find our buildings node. We haven't been clean though. Let's go up into our buildings node, and underneath the final merge, drop down a null. Let's drop down a null underneath the final merge and call it out buildings. I'm going to visualize that and color it green. Let's jump back into Skyline, and then our object merge retrieve that new node. Outbuilding should now be at the top. We're going to move that into this object, and if we visualize it, we should have our buildings there. I'm going to turn off this point visualization. Now what we're going to do is we're going to be copying. Let's drop down a copy node. Those buildings from the left input onto the points of the right input. But if we middle mouse on our yellow node, we should see that we have 2,889 points. Depending on how many mid sections we get, that could even increase. So it's going to have to copy almost 3,000 building sections onto the city. As bounding boxes, that might be fine, but even if we would visualize them as buildings, that would become a very heavy process. So just before we do that, I want to make sure we pack this correctly. I want to pack them by name, right? If we don't do this correctly, it's going to pack every single face by itself. So if we drop down a pack node, you can see that we can pack by name, but it doesn't have a name attribute, so it's going to error out. Invalid name attribute for partitioning. And if we hover over the name attribute, we can see specifies the primitive string attribute used to identify primitives belonging to each fragment. So this name attribute will have to be a string as well. If it doesn't have a name attribute as a string, it doesn't work. If I would say building ID, wouldn't work because building ID is not a string, it's an integer. Let's type name back in and fix that. Let's drop down a point wrangle, and we're going to do a tiny bit of vex in between the Python. It's going to be a single line. Let's open that up a bit. I'm going to type it in a bigger window for you guys. We're going to create a name attribute. At name is integer to string, and we do that by I2A, I at building ID, and finish with a semicolon. What this does, I2A, it converts an integer value to a string value and wires it up, in this case, to at name. So it takes our building ID, makes it into a string, and pipes that value into an attribute called name. Let's apply and accept. So that's still erroring, and that is because it's looking for a primitive attribute. Let's do an attribute promote, plug that in the middle. We will promote name from point to primitive, and now our pack node should work. There we go. Let's middle mouse, and we have 31 points, and that's correct because we have 31 buildings. Let's drop down a null node. I'm going to call it out building imports, and I'm going to color it yellow again, and I'm going to wire them up to the copy node. So what this does is it basically takes every single point in there and copies that whole stack onto each point. So we will want to copy stamp those onto the points instead. So let's just have a look at our copy node, go to stamp and say stamp inputs. And for that, we're going to have to create a variable to stamp with. We're going to be stamping with building ID. And we can give building ID its correct value by making a point expression here. Point, up one level, out point cloud. We're going to be looking for each point, so $PT. We're going to be fetching the building ID value. And if nothing is found, 0. So that in this case, we can see 1011. For you could be different, it's just random. It should be fetching the correct values for each. So now on the left side, let's drop down a blast node. And that blast node is going to help us filter these buildings. Now if we would look at this, we're basically deleting everything. Click delete non-selected. So if we type a number into our group, we can see that we're actually isolating something, but we want to isolate by that building ID. So we're going to say at building ID is, and then we're going to open and close these backticks, and backticks define an expression. In between there, I'm going to say stamp. Stamp, open and close brackets. In between them, straight away we do quotation marks, and inside the quotation marks, I'm going to say up one level, copy 1. I'm going to be fetching the building ID stamp value. And if we can't find it, we just enter 0. It always needs a default value there. Let's see what that evaluates to. Building ID is 0. And if we copy on top of our point cloud, that doesn't work. And that's probably because on the blast node, we kind of want to say it's points, but we also forgot to say transfer attributes. Now it should work. So the chain should look like this. We have an I2A like this in a point wrangle. We then promote the name attribute from point to primitive. We then pack by name. So we transfer all the attributes on top of the pack. Then we blast with this expression, building ID, and that expression is found here, building ID with that point expression. Once we do that correctly, we can see that all our buildings are being copied onto our points. Let's go up one level, visualize the city blocks before it's cut to pieces, so the transform one that will do. And we can see that our buildings are actually not properly aligning to the roads. And that is probably just a rotation value, because you can see that they are actually rotating along. They're just sort of exceeding that edge. And this is probably a matter of x-axis versus z-axis, as in normally z-axis would be forward, but in my case it was x. So we probably have to just rotate them. Transform, pipe it in the middle here, and then rotate y, let's say 90. And sure enough, that does it. So now we have our building bounding boxes all copied onto our points. Let's drop down another null node, do our copy, call it out city. So we've now got our bounding boxes on our city. We've put down our out node, but when we look at the city buildings themselves, we can see that something's not quite right. So let's have a look. For example, I see buildings here that only consist of 2 sections, then there's one here that has 4 sections. So somewhere it's not going entirely as expected. To fix this issue, we will have to find out what's going wrong. And in order to be able to do that, we're going to have to visualize these buildings better. If you'll join me in the next clip, we'll take care of that.